are reading Chapter 4, Entrapped at the Bottom of the Sea. Ch4 was nothing more than a small volcanic mound of black rock and thick vegetation in the vast blue table of the South Pacific. A small 30-mile-long island that served no other real purpose than to be a stopping and resting point for passing fishing boats, trade schooners, and yachtsmen who were lost. On the lee side of the island, serving as the very center of the island's activity and culture, was Bad Dave's trade store. A miserable, gloomy box with concrete walls cracked by too many earthquakes and a tin roof weighed down with old tires to keep the next hurricane from blowing it away. Parked in the deeply rutted road in front was Bad Dave's coconut-battered Land Rover, and only 100 feet down a shallow bank were the crashing and hissing waves of the Pacific. Inside the store, local natives wearing grass skirts and little else browsed and handled their way up and down the crowded shelves of clothing, tools, fuel cans, vegetables, and hog carcasses. Sailors, fishermen, and travelers looked for obscure repair parts, lengths of rope, fish hooks. Bad Dave kept busy at the counter, bartering, arguing, selling, bellowing, and swapping the latest news, no matter how stretched the tales might be. He was a big suntan man, built like a tank, who always had a wad of gum in his mouth and a roll of very wrinkled dollar bills in his shirt pocket. He'd been living on this island and practically running it single-handedly for 26 years. He knew almost everyone who came sailing through, knew whom he liked and whom he didn't, who owed him money from their last time in the store and how much. He was having a good time today and was not at all ready for the interruption when Bojo, his hired native, stepped quickly out of a back room, hurried behind the counter, and whispered something in his ear. "You sure?" Dave whispered back. Bojo nodded. "Big, bad, black, hungry. Who else is back there?" "Only two," said Bojo. "Red hair and Kelly." Dave winced. "Kelly. Bojo, we'll keep this to ourselves, all right?" Bojo nodded, following Dave to the back room. Dave grasped the handle on the door and opened it very slowly. Within the room, surrounded on every side by heavily stocked shelves of canned goods, dried goods, and machinery parts, two people sat at a small table opposite each other, a well-used chessboard between them. One was Kelly, a stubborn little sailor who managed to keep himself idle for most of his years, and who had a very risky passion for betting on anything. The other was a flower, a crimson crown jewel, a heaven-sent angel that had floated in on a cloud of blessing. That was how Bad Dave liked to describe the woman sitting at the chess table, presently engaging Kelly in a steely-eyed stare-down that had to have been going on for hours. Her name was Megan Flaherty, a writer. She was casually dressed in light slacks and a work shirt, and her red hair cascaded over her shoulders like surf over the rocks at sunset. But right now she was more a marble statue than a woman. She was frozen, unmoving, unwavering, unblinking. Dave looked at Kelly. The little sailor was frozen as well, although one eye twitched just a bit. Dave leaned over and whispered to Bojo, "How long have they been at it?" "An hour, maybe. They were playing chess for a bet, but then Red Hair made the bet bigger. She said, 'Kelly, how long can you sit there and not move a muscle?' And he said, 'Forever, ma'am.' And she said, 'Would you like to bet on that?' And he said, 'You have a bet.' And so they've been sitting here like this for all that time?" Bojo nodded. Dave shook his head. "Sun's going down. It won't warm up in here till morning. They will not make it. I know Kelly won't. Mrs. Flaherty, she always has surprised me. So, what can we do? Wait, that's all. We'll close the place early and keep the doors shut. Nobody gets in, understand? Try to keep it quiet around here. I'll keep watch over them for now. You come to take your turn about 10 tonight." Bojo left the room and found a place to sleep atop some grass mats. Dave stayed in the back room, supposedly refereeing the great wager, but spending most of the time with his eyes on the lady's pant leg and his hand very near the handle of a razor-sharp machete. The hours passed. Midnight came. Kelly almost sneezed once, but managed to stifle it. Neither party moved. Now, Bojo was taking his turn keeping watch, and just thinking of the pain those two must be feeling made his own muscles ache. Almost 2 a.m, Dave came into the room very quietly, carrying a kerosene heater. When Bojo saw what it was, he nodded as if to say, "Good idea." Dave set the heater down very quietly near the chess table and spoke to the 2 human statues. "Thought maybe you could use a little heat. It's getting a little cool in here." He lit the heater and stepped back quietly. The room began to warm up, and within an hour, the room was stifling. The bettors' faces began to glisten and drip with sweat. Kelly was getting very glassy-eyed. Now both Dave and Bojo were watching the lady's pant leg. With the heater so close to that leg, the heat had to be very uncomfortable. Suddenly, Bojo's eyes got wide and he made just a slight noise that he stifled with his hand. Dave held him still and whispered, "Not now, Bojo, of all times. No noise now." They could both see the pant leg stirring as if alive, heaving in and out, the wrinkles forming and then flattening. Dave moved his hand very slowly toward the machete. The 2 sitting at the table didn't notice what he was doing. They were still staring at each other in total concentration. The pant leg was still moving. Now they could see a bump moving down toward the cuff. A shiny black head suddenly emerged, weaving to and fro, a thin red tongue licking the air. Bojo clasped his hands together tightly to keep them from shaking. Dave gripped the machete. The head dropped slowly to the wooden floor, dangling from a long, black, sleek body. The snake continued to pour inch by inch from the pant leg, slithering out from under the table and slowly exploring the room with wags of its black head and flickers of its red tongue. It approached Dave, but he did not move until the right moment. Wham! The machete came down and instantly separated the snake's head from its body. The body curled and writhed and then lay still. The head came to rest with the white mouth gaping, the glistening fangs extended. Bojo screamed simply because he had to. Kelly lost the bet as he stole a glance sideways, saw the snake, and leaped out of the chair with a loud gasp and very salty language. The lady expelled a long-held breath and relaxed, her head flopping forward. "The Lord be praised," she said quietly. Then, with a trembling hand, she picked up her queen and gently bumped Kelly's king off the chessboard. "Checkmate." Kelly only stood there, frozen with terror at the snake and unbelief at the lady's last move. What? How can you? I had all night to think about it, she said, wiping the sweat from her brow. Then she asked Dave, could you show a lady to the powder room? Straight through there, said Dave, pointing. She hurried out of the room as Kelly looked at the dead snake, then the chessboard, then Dave and Bojo. Sorry about this, Dave said. We figure some of these devils must have come on the island with a load of bananas. He reached down and gathered up the dead snake, whistling his amazement at its size. They like to crawl into warm, dark places at night to keep warm. He noticed a hole in the floor right under the chess table. Here's how he got in. Bojo, we'll have to put a patch that up. Bojo nodded his head. Kelly's face was full of questions, but he was still too terrified to say a word. Dave told him, it's a good thing you took up Mrs. Flaherty's bet. The snake was coiled around her leg. They say the bite only takes seconds to kill you. She saved both your skins. Mrs. Flaherty returned, cooler and calmer. Thank you, David. Dave was turning off the kerosene heater. You're very welcome. Mrs. Flaherty, I guess he finally got warm enough to want to leave your pant leg. Kelly stared at the lady for a long time. She responded with a very relieved smile. Kelly stammered, You are quite a woman, Mrs. Flaherty. She replied, and you are a very worthy opponent, Mr. Kelly. But tell me, will you honor our agreement? Huh? I've won the chess game fair and square, and our bet too. Will you tell me what I want to know? Kelly still wasn't thinking straight and didn't answer. Dave decided to help him. Come on, Kelly. You remember, you and those commies were in cahoots, and everybody knows it. Kelly brightened as if his memory had just clicked on and said, Oh, that! He looked at Mrs. Flaherty. What was it you were asking me? Mrs. Flaherty motioned Kelly to a chair and took one herself. When I first set foot in Pulasapi, this island was crawling with Philippine guerrillas. You'd think they'd called a convention. Dave grabbed an empty wooden barrel and sat himself down. They were in the store all the time with lots of money to spend and feeling pretty cocky. Somebody's been paying them in money and weapons, and they have some big caper going on somewhere. Kelly forced a chuckle. Hey, what would I know about that? Mrs. Flaherty was unbending. They're gone now, and very suddenly. And I know it was you who ferried them away in your boat. Where did you take them, and why? Dave leaned in close. A bet's a bet, and you've lost. Remember that. Kelly thought about that for a moment, and then nodded regretfully. You can't tell them where you got any of this from. Agreed, said Mrs. Flaherty. Kelly probed his mind for a starting point. There's about 100 of them, all from the Philippines, a long way from home. They're being paid very well to carry out some special errand for their financiers. The Soviets? Asked Dave. Yeah, who else? Call it a fundraiser. If they ever expect to overthrow the Philippines, they have to have money, and the Soviets have struck a deal with them, paying them a lot to carry out some special business. What business? Asked Mrs. Flaherty. That I don't know, really. They wouldn't tell me. They just paid me to take them to Kurno and not ask questions. So I did. Kurno? Yeah, it's a little island north of here. Nobody there as far as I know, except guerrillas. But something's supposed to happen there really soon, and they're all getting ready for it. Can you show me how to get there? Kelly's eyes widened a little. Hey, Mrs. Flaherty, you'd better learn how much is enough. You're only one little woman, and these guys are 100 and very mean. Dave just shook his head and said, "Give the lady what she wants, Kelly, unless you want to lock horns with her again for the rest of the night." Kelly shrugged. "You've got charts, Dave. Get them out and I'll show you where it is. But ma'am, you'll have to get there by yourself. I don't want those cutthroats seeing me bringing you into their plans." "Fine," said Mrs. Flaherty. "Dave, I need to make a call to my Air Force chum in Japan." "I'll warm up the radio," Dave answered. Lila had taken a large canvas from the big crate inside the pod and had wrapped it several times around her for warmth. Now she sat in the pod in the dark, the flashlight turned off to save the batteries. She breathed from the oxygen bottle only now and then, trying to save that supply as well. She was trying to think, trying to pray. "Lord," she prayed, "I don't know where I am or if I'll ever get out of here. Please help me. Please send someone to rescue me. Please." She stopped. She could feel the Lord speaking back to her, but what he was saying to her heart was not what she wanted to hear. "Lord God, I need help. I can't think about that now." His still, small voice would not be silent. He was bringing a scripture to her mind. "If you were presenting your offering at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and present your offering." Now she sat there in the dark, not saying anything, not praying anything. "It's Dad's fault," she thought. "It's always been his fault." "Lord," she said softly, a little afraid to say it, "you're not being fair. I was hurting already, and now you've dumped me into this mess." She remembered some of her father's words shortly before she left Japan. "Lila, you have to be thinking of others. The whole universe doesn't revolve around just you." "He should talk," she replied to her own thoughts. "Since when has he really cared about how I feel?" But the Lord spoke to her heart again, and she argued with him. "Lord, of course I'm thinking about myself. I'm the one in trouble right now. I'm the one who's hurting. I'm the one who just might die in here." I. It seemed like the Lord was pointing out to her how often she said that word. "All right," she finally said reluctantly. I'll talk about Dad and Jay. I wonder what they're doing right now when I'm not with them. I wonder if they miss me." A more sobering thought came to her. "I wonder if they even know I'm in trouble." The Lord spoke again. "Lila, now you're not only thinking about just yourself, you're also thinking about others thinking about you." She sagged with frustration and rested her head against the cold metal wall. All right. I'm thinking of myself." "What about that time at the airbase?" "I was thinking of myself then, too. I never should have said what I said." She could see the scene unfolding in her mind like a taped replay. She could see her father carrying her luggage toward the boarding gate. She could see the pain in his eyes. She could recall him saying, "We'll talk about it." And she could hear herself snipping back at him, "I'll believe that when I see it. You just don't care. You've never cared." And she could tell she'd hurt him. She'd scored a direct hit. Lila erased the scene from her mind with a wag of her head. "I didn't feel bad about saying it then, but I thought we'd be able to talk about it more. I thought I'd see him again." She could feel sorrow and despair creeping into her heart like bad news. "Lord, what if I die in here?" The Lord seemed to be silent now. She felt no words from him, but she knew what he was doing. He was giving her time to think about it. Stay tuned for Chapter 5.